Oh, I'm Alan Mothershed, and glad to see everyone. So I will have everyone introduce themselves, including our speakers, rather than me do a formal thing again if it's needed. So Barry, would you say who you are, where you came from?
Well, I'm Barry Bryant. I was born in the hills of East Tennessee and grew up for the most part in North Carolina. And before that, after that, ended up going to college at Tribeca Nazarene University in Nashville, Tennessee, and went from there to Duke. Went from there to serve a church in Manchester, England. And then from there, I went down to serve a church in an African West Indian congregation in central London, and came back. At that time, I became transferred my credentials into the United Methodist Church, and taught at Memphis Theological Seminary for 8-9 years. And I've been at Garrett Evangelical 15. So. I teach United Methodist and Wesleyan Studies.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome. You guys see the meeting.
Next, Annie K. Taylor.
Madge Ginn.
Eve Anderson.
Verna Watkins.
Tom Evans,
Betty Carvel.
Angela Sappho,
And Greg Ferzados. And who's on Zoom? I just want to make sure you can see us, guys.
Let's see.
Paul and Nina.
Paul and Nina and Lynn. Did we get everybody?
Are they muted?
Oh, they are some of them muted. But can you hear us? Hey, Paul, can you hear us? Can you guys all hear us now? So we need to speak louder.
Yep,
Good. Muted.
Yes, you can hear.
Great, just want to let you hear Barry to get started. I didn't hear this week. Thanks for everybody showing up today. We know it's Super Bowl Sunday, and it's hard to go through. But very lucky that Barry's rejoined us for part 2 of history evangelicalism. So, good to be back. Evangelicalism. Not what it used to be. Put it that way. For better and for worse. It would be good to just sort of recap some things. My professor of Old Testament, repetition is the mother of you. I like to begin with a recap. That's the right thing to see when you because this is it's a lengthy time. We love you to just hold your questions in mind, because once Barry gets through all of this is something we can check it out. Now, have to ask is so when you think of the word, the noun, don't really is. You don't know. Evangelical, I took Gary Evangelical as a bit of a case. There, evangelical. So it's a hyphen. Garrett hyphen. And of course, it comes from the Greek word evangelion, is from the New Testament. And that's saying it typically means good news. Eventually, it comes to mean the gospel itself. It is a word gospel. It's used to describe the 4 books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but takes on sort of a proper noun at that point, but that word itself is 75 times. But then again, the meaning changes. It's pretty much confined to the New Testament for that part of 1400 years. So it appeared during the Reformation. And it's used to describe Protestants, but it also is used to describe Anglicans, not just the Protestant church, evangelicals. And the Greek word dream, justification by faith, Easter of all with the Scripture alone. You'll see how these three core doctrines of evangelicalism, German evangelicalism, find their way throughout all of Protestant. But the three characteristics of these doctrines were emphasizing salvation by faith, the atoning death of Jesus Christ through personal conversion. Short term, you get saved, is abbreviated version of that. But also the authority of Scripture. And the Reformation really begins the relationship between Scripture and faith and reading. Both with the family. The importance of preaching is constant with ritual. If you'll remember last week, I talked about the importance of a central pulpit that's elevated above the communion table. Architecturally, there's theology being communicated implicitly. When you walk in and you see the pulpit central, it's elevated above the communion table. The alternative is to have a split chancel, where you've got the pulpits on either side. Usually there's one pulpit reserved just for preaching. And by and large, is the one on in Europe. It's usually the pulpit that you're facing on the right, but the central focus is the communion table, where Jesus is held. The evangelicals proper now is a result of the German influence in evangelical United States. The EUB merged with the Methodist Church in 1968, creating the United Methodist Church. Evangelical, in another sense of the word, so when the Brethren movement and the evangelical movement merged, they formed the Evangelical United Brethren, but the word evangelical in the time of the EUB was a proper noun. It has been used to describe Methodism as an adjective. So the word evangelical appeared in English, used and was used in 1738 to describe a revival that gave rise to Methodism. And that same revival that was going on in Britain had a parallel development, largely due to the exchange of preachers, especially George Whitefield, gave rise to the Great Awakening as Puritan Presbyterian congregation. And eventually it resulted in the Methodist Episcopal Church being created in Baltimore, Christmas of 1784. So Methodism was transplanted to America, not by preachers, but by the laity. And eventually preachers were sent over and with, especially with the help of Francis, the Methodist Episcopal was formally created. Methodism, of course, hit the westward expansion. And part of the westward expansion ended up here. And it was called Northwestern University because at the time Northwestern was founded, it was in the northwest corner of the known world, of the settled world. So the word Northwestern is an archaic reference to American geography. But also at the same time, the same group of people started, Garrett Evangelical. John Dinster was instrumental in that, and he used money from, funds from Eliza Garrett, who was the widow of the mayor of Chicago. It was a very biblical institute. It was merged with Chicago Training School, and had been founded by
her husband Josiah. I want to point out and make reference to it a little bit later that one of the hallmarks of this understanding of evangelical and Methodism was a strong social justice component. In fact, the Chicago Training School came out of the deaconess movement of the Methodist Church, training women to do things like teach school, eventually become what social workers would do, and the like. So there was a very strong social justice component to it. So the word evangelical was commonly used to describe American Methodism during this time period. But how is evangelicalism understood today? I think that just in the past decade, it's gone through some very significant changes, and it's really becoming has taken on some different understandings.
Was it misunderstood?
Yeah, well, or it's understood quite well, just not always in a positive fashion. So what's the 1950s was a watershed moment. What happened at the turn of the century is that there was a conference held in Niagara, in New York, and it sort of saw that modernity, as it's been called, is starting to encroach and as a process of secularization. In fact, I refer to the secular trinity where it was Freud, Marx, and Darwin. Because they began to shape and fashion a worldview that did not need religion in order to take account for. So with Freud, you got a psychoanalytic view that did not need God. With Darwin, you had an understanding of evolution and creation that did not need God. And of course, Marx, with his communism, thought that religion was just the opiate of the people. And so there was a meeting that occurred around the beginning of the 20th century that began to shape and influence what we would eventually understand to be evangelicalism. And eventually it resulted in 1956, Carl Henry and a couple of other colleagues, with significant help from Billy Graham, start the magazine Christianity Today. And in fact, I made available an article from Christianity Today on evangelicalism that describes it from an evangelical point of view quite well. So this would be the flagship of American evangelicalism. And it was a part of the reaction to modernity. And we can go to the next slide. And so a redefinition of the word evangelical began to take shape. Where are the boundaries and borders? You know, how far is the boundaries of evangelicalism? How far can you go and then not be considered an evangelical anymore? So who is in and who is out? There was a lot at stake in the definition of evangelicalism at this time, and for no other reason than the popularity of Billy Graham and the press that evangelicalism started to get. So that the editorial policies of Christianity Today carried with it a shaping of the evangelical narrative. In fact, I can't think of a publication that was more significant in that shaping of the evangelical narrative in Christianity today. And the historian George Marston came up with a definition of an evangelical.
Could you read that fine print, because we can't.
Yeah, I just did. Yeah.
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 Everything that's up there is the same.
Yeah. I'm trying to read it as I go.
Good.
Yeah. So who is an evangelical? Anyone who likes Billy Graham.
It's easy.
Unreal.
George Marston, understanding fundamentalism and evangelicalism, went and he was studying, especially because all the archives are at Wheaton College. That's where the Billy Graham papers, up until just recently, when Franklin Graham decided to take them from Wheaton College and move them to his center in North Carolina, to the alarm of scholars everywhere. I think that Franklin Graham was starting to realize that he was losing control of the narrative, and he gains control of the narrative by setting up himself up as a gatekeeper for access to Graham's papers. And in fact, I've got a PhD student who was working on the Graham Crusade in Chicago in 1972, when the Satanic Panic occurred. And it was actually a group of war protesters, a group of
Next.
yeah. Oh, it was a group of war protesters and a group of different ones who, as a pretty large group, decided to attend the crusade. And when they made their way onto the floor of McCormick Place, Graham told them to encircle them. And try to contain them, and he referred to them later as Satanists.
Oh, my God.
And my PhD student, Mike Erdenstein, was taking this one event up, and he was doing his research at Wheaton when the word came down that Franklin Graham was moving the collection. So he went in and started photocopying and photographing as much material as he could, because he knew that even if he could get to North Carolina, he wouldn't be given access to it.
I got a good question. Do y'all teach about Albert Einstein? Because he was a genius, right? Albert Einstein. Albert
Einstein?
He was a genius, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, because I was wondering, do your students go out of town to different countries, or do they just do their schoolwork? Do they live?
So they can go out of the country if they need to, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And do you all teach them about freedom of religion once they learn all?
Right, yeah.
Y'all teach them about freedom of religion? Oh, okay, good.
Yeah, in fact, I had a class last year on interfaith liberation theology, and had a rabbi and a former Nation of Islam student who, and we co-taught that class, and it was based around love for God and love for neighbor, and deriving an ethic of liberation that comes out of that for Muslims. In fact, I often say that in the United Methodist Church, when you're baptized and you renew your baptism, you make a vow to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever form they present themselves.
They should just put a baptism pool at the schools, so they
Yeah.
don't learn that much about it.
But that's the definition of jihad,
The resistance.
What?
the resistance,
Resisting evil.
resisting evil, injustice,
That's in
and
the
oppression.
UCP ritual, pretty
Yeah.
much too.
Well, that's you're vowing as a Christian to take place. If and my wife knows Arabic. In fact, I've got a daughter-in-law who's Jordanian, and Arabic is actually her first language. But if you set out to translate that passage into Arabic, it would be very difficult to do it without using that word jihad.
Right.
Mhm.
But yet we get all up in arms because there's a fundamentalist wing of Islam. There's a fundamentalist wing of Judaism. There's a fundamentalist wing of Christianity.
Every single one has gone far right.
Yes, right.
Just like politics.
Yeah.
But those continents mostly change their name. I mean, they usually have a birth name, because I found out, because I'm going to school for wedding consultant, most of those continents there, they don't have a real, they're not, you know, they come here and get,
Right.
here and get acknowledged as a citizen, but when they're in
Yeah,
their
they don't
country,
change the religion.
right, when they're in their
It's
country,
a
they're
part
not
of their
married.
identity.
They're not
Yeah.
considered married in their country. They're just given a piece of document and saying that they're
Right.
together.
Yeah.
So I found out the wedding consultant because I'm going to school for that. So that's why they try to get married and have legal,
Yeah,
you know, be legal and say they have a marriage.
right.
Mhm.
Yeah, my daughter-in-law was here on DACA until she married our son. So, yeah. A more precise definition would have to be sought for another generation. You just can't have an evangelical as someone who likes Billy Graham. And so, in 1986, could go to the next slide, David Bevington, who is at University of Stirling in Scotland, who is the sort of the running joke is, are you a self-avowed practicing evangelical? And he is. In fact, he was scheduled to be the external examiner for my dissertation, but he became ill and I ended up getting a Methodist, prominent Methodist historian, Henry Rack. But in 1989, he decided to try and encapsulate, if not a definition, at least an accurate description of evangelicalism. And in doing so, he had hoped to put it on the map, so to speak, and to make it more of a legitimate academic study. And here's what he came up with. It's referred to as the Bevington Quadrilateral. And it attempts to summarize the constitutive traits of evangelicalism. Next. So the first characteristic of evangelicalism is biblicism. And if you'll remember, going back to the German Reformation and Martin Luther, sola scriptura, which was sort of a catchphrase, the Bible alone. And so there's elements of the Reformation and the work of Martin Luther found in this first characteristic of evangelicalism. It has a particular regard for the Bible as having all essential spiritual truth necessary to salvation be found in its pages. Now, that's the way he describes it. If you go to the next one. But eventually fissures are formed as a result of this definition. Because there are some who want to say, and Harold Lindsell, the editor of Christianity Today in 1976, wrote a book entitled The Bible for the Bible, The Battle for the Bible, promoted biblical inerrancy. This was a little bit more fundamentalist in its tone than what Bevington wanted to use, because I think that this issue, the way that Bevington describes it, it includes more people. Because the inerrancy view of the Bible is without error or fault in all of its teachings, with this caveat, in the original autographs.
But no one knows the original autographs.
We don't have the original autographs.
Even if Jesus, even if we had it in Greek, we don't have what Jesus said in Aramaic.
Right.
It's a totally different language.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, there are one or two words that appear that were Aramaic, but also
right.
the academic scholarly consensus is that the Gospels existed in an oral tradition for pretty close to 100 years before they were finally written down. I think that the first to be written down was Mark's Gospel, who was dependent on the Q source I think that started to take shape around 70 AD. And then, of course, I think the oldest document in the New Testament is a letter to the Thessalonians.
Don't they have museums and stuff like that in those countries to show some of those documentation? Or they can't locate them? Which one is it? Just
There's a museum for the Bible, but it's fundamentalist.
It's in DC,
Yeah, it's in DC, and there's another one in Kentucky, I think.
or is that the Ark?
That's the Ark.
But still the same kind of thing, right?
So right away, we see some disagreement over the role of Scripture. It was during this time that Nazarenes, who had considered themselves as evangelical, parted ways with this definition because they didn't think that the Bible was completely and utterly infallible. It was only reliable in matters that pertain to salvation, to faith, and spirituality. And so you see Nazarenes pulling out of this trying to withdraw from the evangelical label because they just did not like the inerrancy of the pair of Lindsell. Misspelled the name, it should be L-I-N-D-S-E. So the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy occurred in 1978.
So where are all these people at? Like, when did they
All
die?
over, and some of them aren't even alive anymore.
Like some of the people that died, like Freud, Albert Einstein, Marx. Did you mention M-A-R-X? Marx?
Yeah,
Yeah, they died.
yeah, they're long gone,
Okay,
but their ideas are still with us.
okay.
So while the statement denies that biblical infallibility and inerrancy are limited to spiritual, religious, or identical things exclusive of assertions in the fields of history and science, we further deny that scientific hypotheses about Earth history may properly be used to overturn the teaching of Scripture on creation and flood. Well, so right away you're seeing an adversarial relationship between science and religion.
And it was just at about that date that real inerrancy began.
Right.
Because I recall,
Yeah.
back in the 1800s or so, or the time that Darwin was coming up, of course there was, oh my gosh, by Christians, but nonetheless, not the negativism about science, period,
Right.
that occurred relatively recently and was hammered home extremely recently by the so-and-sos who are trumping away.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that,
You had the Stokes trial, so you had that all the way back there. So you had the elements of all this. This was trying to solidify it and I guess create a more in or out
right, yeah,
version.
that's exactly what was going on.
It becomes extremely political.
Yes.
And tied up with me, we've got a big talking point that we use short words and the uneducated love it.
Yeah, the dog whistles as they're referred to.
That's a good
Yeah,
phrase.
it's reason when I went to college at Ole Miss, I can remember people always wondered, was he really Christian or not? In fact, I told one of my fraternity brothers I was going in the ministry, said, I don't even pray about this. Because he didn't think I was properly conservative enough.
Right.
If you're in Mississippi, you
And I
have
don't
a
think
problem.
that's true for a lot of Christianity then.
Well, because that Albert Einstein, he was religious and he also was a physics, but he was good with math. He was a mathematician with chemistry
Right.
and
Yeah.
things like that because he knew how to teach people about those.
Yeah, well, even in science, there was a disagreement. Einstein developed the theory of general relativity,
Mhm.
and it was famous for the quote, God doesn't play dice with the universe. And Niels Bohr, who was the science of quantum physics, said, hold my beer. You know, wait a minute. You know, because God does more than just play dice with the universe. Quantum physics has,
Was he a teacher too?
oh, yeah, very noted academic and research scientist. But the second characteristic of evangelical is Christocentrism, which is just a fancy word that says that the cross of Christ is central to evangelicalism because Christ died on the cross for the forgiveness of sins.
Was that the sacrificial or was
Yeah,
it
it
broader
was.
than that?
Yeah, no, it was the sacrificial atonement, that Christ died, was offered up, as a sacrifice for human sins.
Yeah.
Christocentrism is the doctrine of the cross. In plain terms, is the teaching of Christ and Him crucified. Indeed, the doctrine of the cross was so central that Abington called it the fulcrum upon which evangelicalism hinges. But you have to have the view of the Bible that is part of evangelicalism before you can reach this conclusion. You have to have a very cause and effect relationship, especially if it leans more towards a literal reading,
Yeah.
rather than an interpretation. But it's very dependent upon a literal reading.
Finding things in Isaiah, etc.
Right.
Pointing to,
Yeah.
and the timing.
Yes.
People with calendar minds
Yeah.
are very busy.
What kind of Bible did they use in the 1800s? Was it still converted into English, the King James Version Bible in the
King
1800s?
James Version Bible came about in the 16th century,
So
17th
they
century.
had, so the 1800s, they had that King James Version Bible.
Yes,
Mhm.
you know, the authorized version. Yeah. Okay. So the third characteristic is conversionism, that all humanity is in need of conversion and salvation. And if you don't convert them, they're going to hell. It's that simple.
That's awful.
So there is a very much a motivation, motivation to evangelize and missions. Because it was all about saving their souls and not being concerned about their bodies. But what happened with the mission movement is that when missionaries went out into other countries, they did not just try to make Christians out of them, they tried to make Americans out of them too.
Or Swedes, or etc., etc.
Immigrants.
Sorry?
Or Swedes.
Oh, right,
Very
yes,
busy-
right, yeah.
Very busy Swedish
Yeah.
thing, and in Pakistan, other places. But wherever the missionaries went, it was their national perspective.
Yes,
The
right.
colored,
very much so,
Yeah.
yeah.
don't just blame the Americans.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because Bennington is describing this from a British perspective.
Uh-huh,
He's Scottish,
uh-huh.
so he grew up within the soil of Presbyterianism.
Yeah.
So he's very much has firm roots in that Scottish Presbyterianism. Conversionism is belief that lives need to be transformed through a born-again experience and a lifelong process of following Jesus. But eventually evangelicals started to have disagreements about this. In fact, in a recent, well, I'd say recent, it was done about 25 years ago. The Pew Trust did a survey of a religious survey of evangelicals. And curiously enough, 25% of those who responded to the survey were Roman Catholic and identified as evangelical. There were a lot more Roman Catholic, but 25% of the Catholic, let me rephrase that. 25% of the Catholics who responded to the survey identified as evangelical, which I thought was rather interesting. Because among evangelicals, there are some who believe in instantaneous conversion.
Did they get converted right away?
That you're instantly saved. And there are others who insist that it's a lifelong conversion. That's more of a Wesleyan view, that you're not just saved in an instant. I think that if you're to ask one of the students in my class, are you saved? Say, well, I'm being saved. And I think that if you were to ask a Roman Catholic, are you saved? The typical response would possibly be, I am being saved. And so this again creates another gap between the in group and out group.
There will be an interesting comment pertaining to this. For 15 years, I taught boys at Trinity College. The contract that eventually I left and taught at the Music Institute down,
Right.
music of the North Shore, but always taught privately. The contract included the phrase, on what day and date were you saved?
All right. Wow. Yeah. You had two birthdays,
I thought.
the birth and the rebirth.
But that is in print at
Right.
Trinity College,
Yeah,
so.
Right.
consider.
yeah.
Next one.
And finally, the fourth characteristic of evangelicalism is activism. But it is not social activism.
No,
It's activism through
It's us
evangelism
and them.
and missionaries. It's primarily the activism is defined with the savings of souls and not the caring for the body.
So passing out pamphlets, spiritual laws.
Oh, absolutely. I wish I had a dime for every one of those. You know, I'll put in down a chair. Yeah, well, that's,
Or walking the aisle and being converted. I mean,
Yeah.
I had that pressure growing up in the South. You've got to walk
Yeah.
that aisle and make that public confession. You don't know what could happen today when you leave this church.
bless your heart. It was, in the Nazarene, it wasn't just going down and getting saved. It was a second trip going down to get sanctified. And I can remember sitting on the back row of church on a Sunday evening during revival. When I was, 13, 14, we used to draw straws to see who would go down and get saved. So we could go home.
I mean, the service could last until somebody hiked.
No, right, yeah, because the evangelist was not going to shut up until somebody went down there and.
You gotta get home. Yeah.
Was it in
And,
the?
and one Sunday, it was on Super Bowl Sunday.
There was a Ruskin.
Yeah, there you go.
Quick.
Where was that located? What area of the country?
At that time, it was in North Carolina.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Activism is the dedication of all believers, including lay people, to lives of service for God, especially as manifesting evangelism and mission. There's a lack of emphasis on social ethics and concern for human bodies and not just souls. So, Tim Larson, who's at Wheaton, responded to Babington, and he pretty much covered the same territory, but there's a couple of differences that he has, and we'll just look quickly at these. He expands the definition. He says an evangelical is an Orthodox Protestant. So an Orthodox Protestant and whatever that means.
Yeah.
I think that he's trying to cut Catholics from the herd.
That would be typical.
Yeah, because there was a growing number of Catholics who were not just evangelical in their self-identification, but also Pentecostal.
Oh, yeah.
Charismatic Catholics, a huge movement within the Roman Catholic Church. So he's trying to revive the anti-Catholic sentiment that was present in Luther. But it also stands in the tradition of global Christian networks arising from 18th century revival movements associated with John Wesley and George Whitefield. Wesley in England, and largely George Whitefield, who was a Calvinist, and his work in Boston, in the U.S. George Whitefield was the divine dramatist. It's the title of one of his biographies. And there's a story about he was going to Boston to preach, and Benjamin Franklin got word of it. And Franklin had heard that Whitefield could preach to 2,000 people and still be heard. He didn't believe him. So he went out and Franklin measured the Boston Quad, where he would be preaching. He said, I think this could probably hold about 2,000 people. And so Whitfield was on one end, Franklin was on the other. He heard the sermon and was so impressed by it that he gave 20 continental US dollars to his orphanage.
Oh my God.
So that's, you know, and Albert Garrick, an actor on the theater in the 18th century, said that he envied Whitfield because he could pronounce the word Mesopotamia and make it and read.
What would Thomas Jefferson like? What would he like?
Who?
Thomas Jefferson.
Now, that's another story. Yeah,
Let's get through these.
bring it back and I'll talk about him. An evangelical is an orthodox who stands in tradition of global Christian networks. And of course, that identifies Wesleyan Methodism and that brand of Wesleyan evangelicalism, as well as George Whitfield, who was the Calvinist. But as a preeminent place for the Bible in the Christian life is divinely inspired, final authority in matters of faith and practice. And it's sort of moving away from the inerrancy view, who stresses reconciliation with God through the atoning work of Christ on the cross, and who stresses the work of the Holy Spirit in the life of an individual to bring conversion in the ongoing life of fellowship with God and service to God, and including the duty of all believers to participate in the task of proclaiming the gospel to all people. It's this Holy Spirit language that seems to want to cut Catholics out to bring Pentecostals in.
Open it up.
Yes,
The right perspective.
right,
As of the left,
right.
cutting it out. Where do the Lutherans fit in? That was my upbringing. Concordia Evangelical Lutheran.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah.
One more that I want to look at, because I think that she brings something to the matter. Molly Horton, she's associate professor of history at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and her recent book, Apostles of Reason, The Crisis of Authority in American Evangelicalism, really does, I think, strike at the heart of it. And it goes to, as we've seen, the tension between the authority of Scripture and the authority of science. And if you go to the next one,
That's a lot.
yeah, I
Sorry
need
to
to,
people.
yeah, can you move that
I'll
to,
try.
yeah, to the other side of the screen?
You
I tried to come
post
with
and listen.
Well, I think you can pull that over.
Maybe we'll drag it.
Yeah, just drag that over.
This,
Yeah, from there, yeah.
oh yeah, there we go.
The term evangelical has produced more debate than agreement. The word is so mired in adjectives and qualifiers contaminated by politicization and stereotype that many commentators have suggested that it has outlived its usefulness. In America alone, the broad tent of evangelicalism includes a definition defining an array of doctrines, practices, and political persuasions. Perhaps no label is elastic enough to contain a flock that ranges from churchly Virginia Baptists to non-denominational charismatics in Los Angeles. At the same time, the mudslinging of the 1990s culture wars turned many conservative American Protestants away from a label now synonymous in the media with right-wing radicalism and prejudice. Yet we are stuck with it. Believers and atheist scholars, politicians, and pundits all continue to use the word evangelical. And the next, evangelicals in America have fraught relationships with secular reason and imagination. That takes up the riddle of anti-intellectualism in a community that believes ardently in the power of ideas and examines its sources and consequences in the past 70 years of evangelical theology, worship, and culture. Evangelicalism is a far more thoughtful and diverse world than most critics and even most evangelicals themselves usually realize. Yet it does host a potent strain of anti-intellectualism, a pattern of hostility and ambivalence towards the standards of tolerance, logic, and the evidence by which most secular thinkers in the West have agreed to abide. Contrary to the insinuations of many who have chronicled the fortunes of American evangelicals, this anti-intellectualism is not primarily due to a potent and disturbing set of authoritarian tendencies in conservative evangelical culture. And basically, she's describing that the authority or the sources for truth. You know, what do you do when science, reason comes up with a different conclusion than what your reading of the Bible brings about? And I'll give you an example. LGBTQ inclusion in the church. All of the medical journals, well, all of
Psychological names.
well, yeah, the diagnostic manuals have taken homosexuality out of the diagnostic manual for perversions. That is, it is an acceptable way of human sexuality. All that came about back in the 70s when homosexuality was removed from the diagnostic manual. That's really the beginning of the LGBTQ movement. And once it was removed from the diagnostic manuals, that's when the religious right and the political right started ramping up the rhetoric around LGBTQ inclusion. And eventually it swept through the churches. And I can remember talking to a Roman Catholic colleague of mine that I had, Jeff Grove, when I was in Memphis. We were talking about what was going on in the United Methodist Church. Because Brother Jeff, who was a Lasallian and a Christian brother, said that it's really another manifestation of the science and religion debate. And when I began to think about it, it really is. And a part of the culture wars that have emerged around this very narrow view of the Bible and its relationship to reason.
Right.
Well, one good thing, one thing they do, because I know you were talking about the South. I know they get radical, talking about Jim Crow and things like, he was from the South, right? Jim Crow?
Who?
Jim Crow.
I think he's the personification.
Yeah,
of,
I think that's just
individual
just a term they use to describe a set of laws.
And a few more slides, then we can get into some
Yeah.
conversation here.
Evangelicals share this history. And they also share a set of fundamental questions. While they differ from one another on the details of their ideas about God and humankind, three elemental concerns unite them: how to repair the fracture between spiritual and rational knowledge, how to ensure salvation and a true relationship with God, and how to resolve the tension between the demands of personal belief and the constants of a secularized public square. These are problems of intellectual and spiritual authority.
Who is dealing with that particular situation?
Molly Worthen.
Mhm.
Molly Worthen.
Oh, okay, we're
In
still
her,
quoting from her.
In her book, Apostle of Reason.
Gotcha.
Next slide. But this authority is accompanied by power.
Mhm.
And the authority is accompanied by power, and that's the reason why power always goes out with evangelists and missionaries. There is always an element of coercion with this particular point of view. And the power that accompanies authority comes with proper use and, of course, abuse. And the proper use of power results not in the oppression of other people, but in their liberation that comes about and results in human thriving. And I think that this is really the fundamental difference between evangelicalism and some of the more progressive denominations. Next. So, yeah. Is the term evangelical even redeemable? Who are the Trump supporters who tell pollsters that they're evangelicals? The term has evolved into a theological algorithm used to try to identify certain groups. And I think it's become more of a dog whistle.
Yeah.
A way that is used to identify certain political groups. But scholars can't seem to do without it. It's just a very shorthand way of generalizing and categorizing a large swath of Protestant Christianity. What it means now is whites who consider themselves religious and who vote Republican.
I was gonna ask you a question. Do they, for your
Can you, let me get through here and I'll take all the rest of the questions. So just don't forget that.
okay.
But I want to come back to it. And this is Thomas Kidd. Is the term evangelical redeemable? Next slide. So that there are three corrupting factors to this corruption of the word evangelical. The success of evangelical movement itself, most saw themselves as evangelical, but because the terms associated with Protestant Christian are even what it meant to be American. The political alignments of the 70s and the 80s, beginning with Nixon's Southern strategy, he pulled evangelicals into the Republican Party. And even Reagan, as he aligned himself with a moral majority of Jerry Falwell. But once the Southern evangelicals started voting Republican because of the political agenda of Nixon, that's when the South started voting Republican. But also modern political polling. Pollsters are good at collecting data, but terrible at understanding the people being polled. You're going to get skewed results if you don't know the question to ask. Good answers begin with good information begins with good questions. The problem was allowing respondents to define their own religious affiliation, rather than finding a way to analyze the affiliation. So will the term survive? It depends, but not likely. New urban churches don't look anything like what most associate with the term. Younger congregations will probably abandon the name or try to rebrand it. And if the word is no longer useful, there will still be Christians who practice the essentials of the essential faith of the evangelicalism. So it results in what I think is if you need a sort of a clear indication of its failure, and this is my opinion, the rise of social welfare and the increased gap in economic disparity is perhaps the single largest indictment for the failure of evangelicals. If evangelicals, and other Christians too for that matter, simply did what Jesus commanded that we do, to take care of the poor, the naked, the hungry, the thirsty, the imprisoned, there would be no need for social welfare.
Yeah.
But yet welfare has become a whipping post among the religious right. So they've created the set of circumstances that gave rise to sort of the adversarial relationship between the socially progressives, who think that it's perhaps even more important to take care of the bodies than it is to take care of the souls, which is probably what caused Marx to conclude that religion was the opiate of the people. Next slide, and we're just about done here. So at the rise of white evangelical politics, white evangelical voters are comfortable with Trump precisely because he embodies and articulates their deepest social concerns: Christian nationalism, Christian tribalism, political moralism, and anti-statism. While this white evangelical political quadrilateral call this the white evangelical political quadrilateral. Christian nationalism is the engine that drives white American evangelical politics.
Well,
So are Black Christians evangelicals? This is done by Jamar Tisby, who wrote the article and raised this question, that Black Christians can be considered evangelicals, but to the extent that they assert racial and social justice concerns. Their participation in white evangelical circles have been circumscribed. Black Christians and evangelical churches and organizations must always face the issue of limits and control based on how explicitly they address the issues such as racism, police brutality, economic inequality, and access to quality education in their ministry, and how comfortable the white majority is with their message. So evangelicalism started out with Wesley as ecclesial and social reform. In 1763, the question was raised, why did God raise up the preachers called Methodists? The answer that Wesley gave was not to form a new sect, not to leave the Church of England, but to reform the nation, and particularly the church, and to spread scriptural holiness. Scriptural holiness was his dog whistle for love of God and love of neighbor. And his 4 areas of reform were poverty, prisons, human trafficking, and healthcare. But I think that my argument is that Wesleyan Methodism is classical evangelicalism, which is a far departure from what we see in our culture and public forum today. So,
and isn't it interesting that the current stuff that the far-right Republicans, Scott specifically, is trying to do is to get rid of Medicare, Social
right.
Security,
Yeah.
ping, 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 right down the list.
Yeah, we saw it
That's what
Tuesday
they want
night.
to do.
Yeah.
And
Do they learn any math at those schools? Do they learn any math at their school? Do they have any math scholars there? Or that's just all?
Math?
Yeah, math.
Not at our school.
Just
Yeah.
basically reading and writing.
Yeah.
But to me, it's interesting that, I would say, one of the things I'm listening and hearing from rural Americans who are evangelical is they're very upset that, that they've lost their sense of dignity because of work has been lost.
Oh,
Status has
because of
been
what?
lost, and you lose status, and they feel like welfare is, we don't want welfare, we want our dignity and status
Right.
back. And so they see this pushing for that is pushing to keep people not to revitalize
Right.
who they are. And I think that's a lot of, that is actually a question of justice.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, they don't understand the connection between that and their
Right.
politics.
the State of the Union speech, when the hecklers
Yeah.
got screwed by the president, it was one of the great moments of
Yeah. He
political
was
life.
trolling.
Oh, I just love it.
Yeah.
They stand up and put their
Yeah.